After the will reading, my sister looked at me and said, "We are contesting this immediately." My father was a man of strict habits and very few words. He lived in a small cabin on the edge of a lake for 30 years. After my mother passed away, he became a ghost. He stopped answering the phone. He stopped coming to Sunday dinners. My sister and I lived 3 towns over, but we were busy. We had careers and kids and lives that felt too heavy to carry all the way out to the woods. We called it giving him his space. In reality, we were just waiting for him to be convenient again. 4 years ago, a woman named Clara moved into the cabin down the road. She was a retired nurse who just wanted peace. She started checking on my father because she noticed his porch light stayed on all day. She found him collapsed on his kitchen floor after a stroke. She stayed with him in the hospital. She was the one who learned how to change his bandages and manage his medications. When the doctors said he needed full-time care, Clara offered to move in. My sister Sarah and I were relieved. We told ourselves it was a blessing. We sent Clara a check every month for her trouble and we went back to our lives. We visited on holidays. We brought expensive gift baskets that my father couldn't eat. We spent 60 minutes looking at our watches and then we fled. Clara was always there in the background. She was the one who knew his favorite radio stations. She was the one who held his hand when he had nightmares about the war. My father passed away 2 months ago. We all gathered at a mahogany table in a sterile office for the will reading. Sarah was already talking about what she was going to do with her half of the lake property. She had a contractor lined up to flip the cabin into a luxury rental. The lawyer cleared his throat and read the final revision. My father had left the cabin and the surrounding acreage to Clara. He left Sarah and me his old truck and a small savings account that wouldn't cover a mid-sized sedan. He wrote a note in the will that said, "Clara gave me back my dignity while my children were waiting for me to lose it." Sarah exploded. She stood up so fast her chair hit the wall. She called Clara a predator. She accused her of brainwashing an old man in his weakest moments. She looked at me and said, "We are contesting this immediately." She already had a lawyer on retainer who specialized in estate disputes. She told me all I had to do was sign a statement saying our father was not of sound mind when he made the change. I looked at Clara. She was sitting at the end of the table looking smaller than I had ever seen her. She wasn't angry. She just looked exhausted. She told us she didn't want the money. She said she just wanted to make sure the woods stayed the way our father loved them. She offered to let us keep the furniture and the family photos. Sarah told her to shut up and wait for the summons. Then she pushed the paperwork toward me and told me to sign. I pushed the pen back. I told Sarah that our father was the sharpest man I knew until the day he died. I told her that he knew exactly what he was doing. He didn't leave the house to a stranger. He left it to the only person who actually lived in it with him. Sarah started screaming. She said I was betraying the family. She said I was spitting on our mother's memory. I told her that our mother would have been ashamed that a neighbor had to be the one to hold her husband's hand while he died. I told her that we didn't lose the house in a lawyer's office. We lost it every time we chose a movie or a gym session over driving 20 minutes to see our dad. I walked out of the office. Sarah has sent me 50 emails calling me a coward and a traitor. She is moving forward with the lawsuit on her own, but her lawyers told her it is almost impossible to win without my testimony. She is furious because her payday is slipping away. I went out to the cabin yesterday. Clara was sitting on the porch. She tried to apologize to me for the drama. I told her she had nothing to apologize for. I sat with her for 3 hours. We didn't talk about the will. We talked about the way the light hits the lake at sunset. It was the longest I had sat on that porch in a decade. My sister thinks I am the enemy because I am not fighting for my inheritance. But I realized that you cannot inherit something you abandoned years ago. Clara earned that house one bandage and one conversation at a time. I am just the guy who shared his DNA, and I finally realized that blood does not give you a right to a house you never bothered to call home. Sarah didn't stop at emails. By Wednesday, she had blocked my number and started leaving voicemails on my wife's phone, claiming I was having a mental breakdown or that Clara had somehow bought me off. It's funny how people who are obsessed with money assume everyone else has a price. My price was just the truth, and apparently, Sarah couldn't afford that. She filed the formal petition on Friday. I got the notification while I was at work, sitting in a fluorescent-lit office where I'd spent the last 10 years trying to earn enough to buy things I didn't need. The paperwork was thick, full of words like undue influence and diminished capacity. It painted a picture of my father as a senile old man being manipulated by a predatory caregiver. It made me sick to my stomach because I knew the man they were describing wasn't the man who sat on that porch. My father was stubborn. He was sharp. Even after the stroke, when his speech was slow, his eyes were clear. He knew exactly what he was doing when he signed that paper. He was firing us. I called the lawyer Sarah had hired, a guy named Miller who sounded like he'd never stepped foot outside a city block. I told him I wouldn't be a witness for them. In fact, I told him that if they took this to court, I would testify for Clara. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Miller told me I was making a mistake. He told me the property was valued at over $800,000 now because of the lakefront development. I told him I didn't care if it was worth $8 million. The next morning, I drove back out to the cabin. I didn't tell Sarah. I didn't tell my wife. I just needed to be there. When I pulled up, I saw Clara in the garden. She was wearing a pair of my father's old work gloves, the yellow leather ones with the oil stains on the palms. She was weeding the tomatoes. She looked up and waved, a small, hesitant movement. I realized then that she was terrified. She was a woman in her 60s with no family of her own, and my sister was trying to bulldoze her life with a legal team. "You don't have to be here," Clara said as I walked up the gravel path. "I know it's hard for you. I want to be here," I said. "I should have been here a long time ago." We sat on the porch again. The air smelled like pine needles and damp earth. It was a smell I had forgotten, or maybe one I had just ignored. Clara went inside and brought out a box. It wasn't a fancy box, just a cardboard moving carton with Dave written on the side in black marker. "He wanted you to have these," she said. "He told me to give them to you after the legal stuff was settled, but I think you should have them now." I opened the box. It wasn't jewelry or money. It was journals, dozens of them. My father had kept a log every single day since 1994. I picked one up at random and opened it to a date 3 years ago. October 14th, rain. Clara brought over some beef stew. "My leg hurts today," called the kids. Sarah said she had a PTA meeting. Mark didn't pick up. Clara stayed and we played cards. She lets me win sometimes. I think she thinks I don't notice. I felt a physical weight in my chest. I flipped through more pages. It was the same story over and over. Short, blunt sentences, weather reports, health updates, and the tally of our absences. He didn't write it with anger. He wrote it like he was recording the tide. It was just a fact of his life that we weren't in it. I looked at Clara. "How many times did he call us?" She looked down at her lap. "He stopped calling about a year ago. He told me he didn't want to be a chore on someone's to-do list. He said he'd rather be a memory than a burden." That hit me harder than any of Sarah's insults. We had turned our father into a to-do item. We had optimized him out of our schedules. The legal battle dragged on for another month. Sarah's lawyer tried to find a doctor who would testify that my father's stroke had caused permanent cognitive decline. They found a specialist who looked at his charts for 10 minutes and was willing to sign a statement for a fee. It was disgusting. They were trying to erase the last 4 years of my father's life just so they could tear down his house and put in a deck with a hot tub. I finally called a meeting. I told Sarah I'd meet her at the cabin. No lawyers, just us. She showed up in her SUV, looking like she was ready for war. She stepped out of the car, her heels sinking into the mud of the driveway. She looked at the cabin with such contempt it made my blood cold. "Are you ready to talk sense?" she asked, not even saying hello. "Miller says we can settle this if Clara agrees to a 30% buyout. It's more than she deserves." "I'm not here to talk about a buyout, Sarah," I said. I handed her one of the journals. "Read this." She scoffed. "I don't have time for his old notebooks, Mark. We're losing money every day this sits in probate." "Read it," I said, my voice flatter than I intended. She took it, her expression annoyed. She flipped through a few pages. I watched her face. I waited for the moment it would break. It took about 3 minutes. She hit a page from 2 years ago, right around her birthday. She had told him she was in Florida for a work trip. The journal entry said, "Sarah's birthday." Sent a text. She said she's busy in Miami. Saw a photo on Facebook of her at the park in town with the grandkids. Hope they had fun. Clara brought me a cupcake with a candle. Sarah's hand started to shake. She closed the book. He wasn't supposed to see that. I couldn't handle the drive that day. The kids were being difficult. "We all have excuses, Sarah. We have a mountain of them. But Clara didn't need excuses. She just showed up." "She was paid," Sarah snapped, though the fire was gone from her voice. "We paid her." "We paid her for the nursing," I said. "We didn't pay her to care. There's a difference. You can't buy the way he felt about this place, and you definitely can't buy the right to take it away from the only person who treated him like a human being." Sarah looked at the house, truly looked at it. She saw the peeling paint on the window frames and the uneven stones of the chimney. She saw a paycheck. I saw a grave. "If you go through with this," I told her, "I will go on the stand. I will tell the judge every single time we lied to him. I will show them these journals. I will make sure the whole world knows that we didn't give a damn about him until there was a deed involved. You won't just lose the case, Sarah. You'll lose whatever is left of your reputation." She didn't speak for a long time. The wind came off the lake, cold and sharp. "You'd really choose her over your own sister?" she asked. "I'm choosing Dad," I said, "and for the first time in years, I'm actually listening to what he wanted." Sarah left 10 minutes later. She didn't sign anything then, but 2 days later, her lawyer called Miller and dropped the suit. She sent me one final text. "Don't call me when you realize you've thrown away your kid's inheritance." I didn't reply. I went back to the cabin that evening. Clara was in the kitchen, making tea. The house smelled like cinnamon and old wood. It felt alive. "It's over," I told her. She sat down heavily in one of the mismatched kitchen chairs. She didn't cheer. She didn't celebrate. She just cried quietly. "I didn't want to take it from you," she whispered. "I really didn't." "You didn't take anything," I said. "You saved it." I stayed for dinner. We had soup and bread. We sat in the living room, and for the first time, I didn't look at my watch. I didn't think about the emails waiting for me or the commute back to the city. I just sat in my father's chair and looked at the dust motes dancing in the light of the floor lamp. I realized then that Sarah was right about one thing. I had thrown something away, but it wasn't an inheritance. I had thrown away the guilt I'd been carrying for years. I couldn't fix the fact that I wasn't there when my father died. I couldn't take back the gift baskets or the missed phone calls, but I could make sure that the person who times was times there didn't get punished for our failures. As I drove away that night, I looked back at the cabin in the rearview mirror. The porch light was on. It wasn't a signal for help anymore. It was just a light in the window, keeping the dark at bay. For the first time in my life, the road home felt like the right direction. The weeks following the settlement were quiet, but it was a heavy kind of quiet. Sarah stopped calling. She didn't just block me, she erased me. I heard through a cousin that she'd told the rest of the family I'd been brainwashed, that I'd probably cut a side deal with Clara to get the house later. It's amazing how people who only value money can't imagine a motive that isn't fueled by it. I started going out to the lake every Saturday. At first, it felt like a penance. I'd show up with a toolbox or a trunk full of groceries, looking for things to fix. I fixed the leaky faucet in the bathroom that my father had lived with for 3 years. I planed down the front door so it wouldn't stick in the humidity. Clara tried to stop me at first. "You're a guest, Mark. You don't have to do this." "I'm not a guest," I told her, tightening a hinge on the screen door. "I'm the guy who should have done this in 2022. We fell into a rhythm. I'd work on the house, and she'd tell me stories. Not the big, dramatic stories you'd expect, but the small ones. She told me how my father used to feed a specific one-legged crow every morning at 7 a.m. sharp. She told me how he'd sit in the dark and listen to old baseball games on the radio because the commentators' voices reminded him of his own father. One afternoon, about 3 months in, I found a loose floorboard in the back of his closet while I was checking for termite damage. Underneath wasn't a stash of cash or a hidden treasure. It was a small, dented tin box. Inside were dozens of Polaroids. They weren't of us. They were of the lake. Every photo was dated on the back. He'd been taking a picture of the same view from the porch once a week for decades. I flipped through them and watched the seasons bleed into each other. I saw the trees grow taller. I saw the dock rot and get replaced. And then, toward the end of the stack, I started seeing Clara. There she was, blurred and candid, hanging laundry. There she was, sitting on the edge of the porch with a coffee mug. In the very last photo, taken maybe 2 weeks before he died, she was looking right at the camera, laughing at something he'd said. On the back of that one, my father had written, "The view is better now." I sat on the floor of that dusty closet and cried. Not the quiet, dignified weeping you see in movies, but the ugly, snot-streaked kind of sobbing that comes when you finally realize exactly what you threw away. He hadn't been lonely because he was alone. He'd been lonely because the people who were supposed to love him had treated him like a chore. Clara hadn't just given him medical care. She'd given him a reason to keep taking pictures. I took the photo out to the porch and showed it to her. She held it with trembling fingers, her thumb tracing the edge of the frame. "He never showed me this," she whispered. "He wasn't much for showing things," I said. "But he saw you, Clara. He really saw you." The lawsuit didn't just end. It faded into a bitter memory. Sarah eventually sold her house in town and moved 2 states away. She didn't leave a forwarding address for me. I think she couldn't stand to be near the lake anymore. It was a giant, shimmering reminder of a loss she couldn't litigate her way out of. Last weekend, I brought my kids out to the cabin. I'd been hesitant, worried about how Clara would feel having noisy teenagers around, but she'd insisted. My son, who usually can't go 10 minutes without a screen, ended up sitting on the dock for 2 hours trying to catch perch with an old bamboo pole I found in the shed. My daughter helped Clara plant perennials along the walkway. As I watched them, I realized that this was the inheritance Sarah had been screaming about. It wasn't the acreage or the property value. It was the ability to sit still in a place that meant something. I'm still the guy who stayed away for too long. I can't change the past, and I don't get to own the house. But every Saturday when I pull up that gravel driveway and see the porch light off because the sun is up and the house is full of life, I feel like I finally earned my way back into the family. Blood makes you related, but showing up, actually showing up when the light is fading and the bandages need changing, that's what makes you a son. I lost a house, but I finally found my father. And in the end, that was the only thing worth fighting for. The trust was finalized by the end of the year. I spent a small fortune on a lawyer who actually had a conscience, someone who made sure the paperwork was airtight so Sarah couldn't find a crack in the foundation 5 years down the line. We named it the David Miller Conservation Trust. It felt right. It turned the land into a sanctuary, a place that could never be carved up into half-acre lots for people with jet skis, and no respect for the silence. Once the pressure of the taxes was gone, the cabin seemed to exhale. The gardens thrived. Clara started hosting small groups of retired nurses for tea on the porch, telling them stories about the stubborn old man who lived there before her. She spoke about my father with a warmth that I still find myself envying sometimes. She remembered the way he took his coffee, 2 sugars, 1 cream, stirred exactly 3 times, and the way he'd grumble at the squirrels for stealing from the bird feeder while secretly leaving extra corn out for them. The real test came last November. I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was Sarah. She didn't lead with an apology. That's not who she is. She led with a demand. She told me her youngest son was applying for a prestigious private college and her husband's firm had hit a rough patch. She wanted to know if the trust offered any dividends or if there was a way to borrow against the equity of the lakefront property. It's not an asset, Sarah, I told her. I was standing in my kitchen, looking out at my own suburban backyard, which suddenly felt very small and very artificial. It's a trust. The money only goes one way toward keeping the trees standing and the roof from leaking. There are no dividends. There is no equity for us. You're an idiot, she hissed. The vitriol in her voice was familiar, like an old song I'd finally stopped dancing to. You've spent your own inheritance and your kid's future on a stranger who hit the lottery by being a glorified maid. I didn't spend their future, I said quietly. I gave them a place to go when the world gets too loud. They love her, Sarah. They love the lake. They don't care about the college fund as much as they care about the fact that they have a piece of their grandfather left. She hung up on me. It was the last time we spoke. A few weeks later, I was out at the cabin helping Clara winterize the pipes. We found an old wooden crate tucked way back under the crawl space, covered in decades of cobwebs. I dragged it out into the light, expecting more journals or maybe some old tools. Inside was a collection of hand-carved wooden birds, dozens of them. Cardinals, blue jays, chickadees. They were exquisite, detailed down to the individual feathers. I picked up a small cedar owl and turned it over. On the bottom, my father's initials were burned into the wood, along with a date from 2005. He never showed these to anyone, Clara said, leaning against the doorframe. He told me once he used to carve when he couldn't sleep. He said he didn't want to sell them because they weren't for profit. They were for the birds he couldn't save. I looked at the crate of silent wooden wings. My father had spent thousands of hours creating something beautiful in the dark, and we, his own flesh and blood, had never even known he had the talent. We hadn't known because we hadn't asked. We hadn't known because we only saw him as a retired accountant, a widower, a chore. We never saw him as an artist. We never saw him as a man with a heavy heart trying to find peace in a block of cedar. I set the owl on the mantelpiece above the fireplace. Keep them here, I told Clara. This is where they belong. That night, as the first snow of the season started to dust the pines, I sat on the porch with a heavy wool blanket draped over my shoulders. Clara was inside, the yellow light from the kitchen window spilling across the frosted boards. I thought about the truck he left me, the one Sarah sneered at. I'd had it restored. It didn't run like a new car. It rumbled and shook and smelled like old tobacco and hard work. I loved it more than any vehicle I'd ever owned. I realized that the inheritance isn't the thing you get when someone dies. It's the things you learn about them when you finally stop expecting them to give you something. I learned that my father was lonely, yes, but he was also incredibly resilient. I learned that he loved the lake more than he loved the city, and I learned that he was a better judge of character than I ever gave him credit for. He knew I'd eventually find my way back, and he knew Clara would be the one holding the door open for me. I'm not a wealthy man by the standards of the guys I work with. I don't have the luxury rental or the 30% buyout, but every time I pull into that driveway and hear the gravel crunch under the tires of my father's old truck, I feel like the richest man on earth. I sat there until the lake turned into a sheet of black glass under the moon. I wasn't waiting for him to be convenient anymore. I was just there, in his space, finally understanding that the best things in life aren't the ones you claim, they're the ones you protect. I closed my eyes, listened to the wind in the hemlocks, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was running out of time. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. After the trust settled into its second year, the cabin stopped being a project and started being a home not just for Clara, but for a version of myself I hadn't met yet. I started staying over on Friday nights. I'd sleep in the small guest room with the slanted ceiling, waking up to the smell of wood smoke and the sound of the lake lapping at the shore. It was the first time in my adult life that my phone wasn't the first thing I touched when I opened my eyes. One Saturday in early spring, I was out by the old tool shed, clearing away the rot from the bottom siding. I noticed a patch of dirt that looked different, tucked behind a massive hydrangea bush my mother had planted 40 years ago. There was a flat stone there, nearly swallowed by the earth. I cleared the moss away and realized it wasn't a stone at all. It was a small concrete marker. Buster, 1998, 2010. A good friend. I remembered Buster. He was a scruffy golden retriever we'd had when I was finishing college. I remembered the dog dying, but I realized I hadn't been there for the burial. I had called my dad from my apartment in the city, told him I was too slammed with finals to drive out, and asked if he could handle it. He'd said, "Don't worry about it, son. Focus on your future." Standing there with a shovel in my hand, I realized he'd spent that entire weekend digging a hole in this hard, rocky soil by himself. He'd made the marker by himself. He'd mourned the only companion he had left in that house by himself, all so I could focus on my future. It was a pattern that had defined our relationship for 20 years. He moved obstacles out of my way, and I used the cleared path to walk further away from him. "You okay, Mark?" Clara asked, coming around the corner with a basket of laundry. "Yeah," I said, wiping my hands on my jeans. "Just realizing I missed a lot of things, Clara. A lot of small things that add up to a life." "He didn't hold it against you," she said, setting the basket down. "He used to tell me that children are like birds. You spend all your time building a strong nest just so they can have the strength to fly away from it." He was proud of how far you went. "I went too far," I said. "I went so far I forgot where the nest was." That afternoon, a black sedan pulled into the driveway. For a second, my heart skipped. I thought Sarah had come back for one last fight. But it wasn't Sarah. A man stepped out, mid-40s, wearing a suit that cost more than my first 2 cars combined. He looked at the cabin with a mixture of professional curiosity and a hint of boredom. "Can I help you?" I asked, stepping forward. "I'm looking for Clara Vance," he said. "I'm with the Henderson Development Group. We sent a few letters, but we haven't heard back." I felt a cold prickle of anger. The letters went to the trust's attorney. "The property isn't for sale." The man smiled, a practiced, thin-lipped expression. "Everything is for sale, Mr. Miller. I assume you're Mark? Your sister, Sarah, gave us your contact info. She suggested that while the property is in a trust, there might be administrative ways to facilitate a transfer. We're looking at the whole shoreline. We're offering 5 times the appraised value for this specific lot. It's the crown jewel of the bay. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a card. Think about what that kind of money could do for your children's education, for Mrs. Vance's retirement. You could buy her a condo in the city with a medical staff on call. Why keep her out here in the middle of nowhere? I looked at the card, then I looked at Clara, who was standing on the porch, watching us. She looked frail from a distance, her gray hair wispy in the breeze, but she wasn't moving. She was anchored to those boards. See that hydrangea bush? I asked, pointing to the one by the shed. The developer blinked. I'm sorry? My mother planted that in 1985. And that concrete marker down there? That's where my father buried his best friend. And this porch? This is where a woman who didn't owe my father anything sat and held his hand while he died because his own children were too busy to show up. I walked over to him, took the card out of his hand, and ripped it into 4 pieces. I dropped them into the mud by his expensive shoes. My sister thinks everything has a price because she's empty, I said. But you can't buy a legacy. Tell your boss that if he sets foot on this gravel again, I'm calling the sheriff for trespassing. This isn't a lot. This is a home. And it's staying exactly the way it is. He didn't say another word. He got back in his car and backed out of the driveway, his tires spitting gravel. I went up the stairs to the porch. Clara was leaning against the railing, her eyes wet. You didn't have to do that, Mark, she whispered. That was a lot of money. You could have changed your life. Clear, 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 clear. I did change my life, I said. I changed it the day I refused to sign that paper in the lawyer's office. This place. It's the only thing I have left that isn't for sale. We sat there for a long time, watching the lake. The sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long, golden shadows across the water. I thought about Sarah, somewhere in her new house, probably staring at a computer screen and calculating what she'd lost. She thought she'd lost $800,000. She had no idea she'd lost the only place where she was ever truly known. As the stars started to come out, I realized that my father's note in the will wasn't just a jab at us, it was a map. Clara gave me back my dignity while my children were waiting for me to lose it. He was telling me that dignity isn't something you inherit, it's something you protect. It's the choice to value a person over a payout. I got up to head inside and start the fire. Before I opened the door, I looked at the mantelpiece where the wooden owl sat. The light from the kitchen caught the cedar grain, making the wood look almost like real feathers. My father had carved it in the dark, but it was finally in the light. I'm the guy who shared his DNA, and I finally realized that being a son isn't about the name you carry. It's about being the person who stands at the gate and says no to the world so that a small piece of peace can stay alive. Clara gave my father his dignity, and in return, he gave me a chance to find mine. The house was hers, the memories were mine, and for the first time in my life, the math finally added up. The years began to settle into the foundation of the house like a slow, deep breath. I turned 55 in that cabin, sitting on the same porch where my father used to watch the seasons change. Clara was slowing down, her gait becoming a bit more measured, but her spirit remained as rooted as the old oaks surrounding the property. We had reached a point where words weren't always necessary. I'd show up on a Friday, and there would be a pot of coffee and a list of small chores waiting for me. It was the most honest relationship I'd ever had. The peace was broken on a Tuesday morning by a phone call from a hospital in Virginia. It was Sarah's husband, Jeff. His voice sounded hollow, stripped of the bravado he usually carried. Sarah had been in a car accident. A distracted driver, a wet road, and a split second that changed everything. She was in the ICU, and the prognosis was grim. I didn't think about the emails, the lawsuits, or the years of silence. I just grabbed my keys. As I was heading out the door, Clara met me at the porch. She didn't ask where I was going. She'd heard the tone of my voice. She handed me a small thermos and a bag of sandwiches. Go, she said softly. She's your sister, Mark. Blood is a heavy thing, but it's yours. I drove 10 hours straight. When I walked into that sterile hospital room, I didn't see the woman who had screamed at me in a lawyer's office. I didn't see the person who had tried to pave over my father's life. I saw a fragile, broken woman hooked up to a dozen machines that were humming a rhythmic, mechanical song of survival. I stayed for 3 days. Jeff was a wreck, and their kids were terrified. I became the person I should have been for my father. I ran the errands. I talked to the doctors. I sat in the plastic chairs of the waiting room and drank bad coffee, watching the clock and realizing how easily time slips through your fingers when you aren't paying attention. On the 4th day, Sarah woke up. When she finally saw me sitting in the corner of the room, her eyes didn't fill with anger. They filled with a confused, desperate kind of relief. Mark, she whispered, her voice rasping. I'm here, Sarah. The house, she coughed, her hand twitching under the thin hospital sheet. I was so angry about the house. It doesn't matter, I said, leaning closer. The house is fine. The lake is still there. None of that matters right now. She closed her eyes, and a single tear tracked through the antiseptic cream on her cheek. I thought if I had the money, I could stop being scared. I thought it would make everything safe. It was the first time I realized that Sarah's greed wasn't born out of malice, but out of fear. She had spent her life trying to build a wall of assets to protect herself from the world, not realizing that the wall was what was keeping her lonely. I stayed until she was stable. Before I left, I did something I hadn't done in a decade. I reached into my bag and pulled out the small cedar owl my father had carved, the one I'd taken from the mantelpiece before I left. I put it on her bedside table. Dad made this, I told her. He made dozens of them. He was an artist, Sarah. We just never looked close enough to see it. She looked at the bird for a long time. She didn't say thank you, and she didn't apologize, but she reached out and touched the smooth wood with her fingertips. It was the closest we had been since our mother's funeral. When I finally drove back to the lake, I was exhausted down to my marrow. I pulled into the driveway at midnight. The porch light was on the light that Clara kept burning for me. I walked into the kitchen, and Clara was sitting there, knitting a sweater for my daughter. She looked up and smiled. How is she? She's going to live, I said, sitting down heavily at the table. She's got a long road, but she's there. Clara nodded and pushed a bowl of soup toward me. Good. Life is too short to leave things broken. I think I finally get it, I said, looking around the kitchen. The house wasn't the prize. It was the anchor. It kept us from drifting so far away that we couldn't find our way back. A month later, a package arrived at the cabin. It was addressed to me, but it was from Sarah. Inside was a framed photograph from 1992. It was a picture of me, Sarah, and our parents sitting on the dock, all of us laughing at something the dog had done. Attached was a small, handwritten note. I still think you're an idiot for the trust, but thanks for coming, and thanks for the bird. It's the only thing in this room that feels real. I didn't show the note to the lawyers, and I didn't add it to a file. I just tucked it into one of my father's journals. Clara passed away peacefully in her sleep 3 years later. She died in the bed she had tended to my father in, surrounded by the woods she had protected. In her own will, she didn't leave the house to me. She knew the trust already handled that. Instead, she left me a small, hand-stitched quilt and a final letter. Mark, it read, you spent a lot of time trying to fix this house, but thank you for letting the house fix you. Tell the kids to keep feeding the one-legged said Crow. He's older now, but he still expects his breakfast at 7. Today, I'm the one who lives in the cabin full-time. My kids come up every weekend, and sometimes even Sarah's kids show up. They sit on the porch and talk about things that aren't money. They talk about the light, the wind, and the way the lake seems to hold on to the sun long after it's set. I'm the guy who shared the DNA, the guy who almost walked away, and the guy who finally stayed. I look at the lake and I don't see a luxury rental or $1 million payout. I see a mirror. And for the first time in my life, I'm not afraid of what's looking back. I am exactly where I belong, keeping the light on for whoever needs to find their way home.